How many times have you met a woman who is being completely bossy, controlling, and determined to make all of the decisions? Maybe you're dating someone like this, you're in a relationship with someone like this, maybe you work with someone like this, or you have a family member where she shows up and this is the dynamic that you have. Chances are it is not fun for you. She tries to make you feel like shit, and all you want to do is get away. Or maybe you decide to go along with it. You play Mr. Nice Guy, right? Because you don't want to be an asshole and you don't want to have to fight back. Likely this rings true in some way, shape, or form for you. And the reasoning behind this type of dynamic is what today's episode is all about. Welcome back to The Naked Connection. This is the show that supports driven men to reach sexual mastery and build deep connections. What's up, you guys? It's Kirsten, your soon-to-be licensed sex therapist. And in this episode, we are going to be exploring ways to no longer be that Mr. Nice Guy. We're going to explore how to get out of playing it safe in dating and relationships and really navigate when a woman in your life is being the boss all of the time. So to have this conversation, I invited Nate Ewert onto the show. He has been leading incredible men's groups and retreats for decades and has really mastered the art of being a man in today's world. So without making you wait any longer, let's get some. Nate Ewert, welcome to The Naked Connection. Excited to have you here today.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, I am in thinking about kind of your area of work and your expertise. I know we've had conversations about masculine, feminine dynamics. What would you say, like, how do you define what is masculine and what is feminine? Or like, what does masculine and what does feminine mean to you?
That's a great question. And that's exactly like the journey that I've been on for most of my life is what does masculine mean? And for me, it's more that question, what does masculine mean? And I haven't really focused so much on what does feminine mean. However,
Mm.
over the years, understanding the interplay between those two, you get a little bit of information on both sides. The way that I see those two things, they're like a yin and a yang, right? So they're a polarity of our existence. They're a way to understand expression and how to show up, how to invite people around us into different states of presence, intimacy, relation. And I think it's really for me about how to show up in a way that helps you relate and invite others into their authentic self. And so from the masculine standpoint, and I love the Chinese dynamics because their initial division in life is the yin and the yang. So the masculine stuff usually falls on the more yang side of their thing, and the feminine stuff falls more on the yin side. So I think about it as energy dynamics and expressions, right?
Mhm.
So looking at some really basic things, we can talk about like logic versus emotion, right? So logic would be more of a masculine expression versus emotion would be more of a feminine expression. And that's not to say anything about sex or gender or orientation. They're just expressions that we can choose, whether we're a man or a woman. And what I've found in doing a lot of the men's work that I've done over the years is when we're in a relationship dynamic that is a man and a woman, if the man is falling more into those masculine expressions, it creates the space, the integrity, the compassion and openness for the feminine to fall into her more feminine expressions.
Mhm.
And so, what is masculine? What is feminine? Like I see them as just expressions on this spectrum of of available traits or
Mhm.
available ways of being, ways of showing up.
Yeah.
So, we can look at, logic, active, focus, assertive, discipline, strength, protective, right? Like those things would fall more on what I would consider the masculine side of this expression versus things like emotional, flow, receptive, nurturing, captivating, empathetic,
Mhm.
allowing. We would see those falling more on the feminine side of that spectrum. And again, all of those things are available to all of us, whether we are men or women. But when it comes to relational dynamics and specifically intimacy and encouraging that really safe space, stepping into one of those on one side allows the other person to step into their side of it to create closeness, connection. And so I guess at the end of the day, that's what it's been about for me, is creating those relations within those intimate containers, that breed safety, that breed connection, that breed a really deepening of love and respect and honesty and vulnerability. And understanding that has been such a huge benefit to my life and my relationships,
Mhm.
and and not just with my intimate partner, with my daughter, with my friends, with everything. The more I've been able to stand in integrity in those more masculine side of the expressions, the easier life has been.
Huh.
For me as a man, right? Who
Yeah.
identifies as a man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The more you've been able to step into the masculine expressions, the easier like your life has become.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
It's it's always pretty simple. Maybe easy isn't the right word, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it does take some strength and some courage sometimes to stand in that, to stand in some of that integrity.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things why I think this topic is so interesting to talk about is especially in like recent years about this concept of how there's toxic masculinity and then it's like, well, I imagine as a guy, then it's like, well, how do I relate to this part of myself or how can I show up in a way, especially when you're like if you've had experiences where like being in this expression is really a powerful and supportive way to live, like where do you go when society has like placed this negative connotation on this specific way of being in the world.
Well, that's the challenge. And I think that's what's been the hardest part for me, and why I actually, for many, many years, steered away from a lot of this work.
Mm,
Most of the examples that I saw of masculine men, they were really falling more on the unhealthy side of those expressions. So, we can look at something, these expressions like focused, active, disciplined, with a vision, with a purpose. Like those are really solid, strong, healthy expressions of masculinity. But you take those too far and it becomes destructive, it becomes aggressive, it becomes narrow-minded, frustrated,
mm,
cold, unemotional. And those types of expressions, unfortunately, are seen a lot out there in the media. And um, I mean, even with some of like the alpha male education that's out there, it can, I think that can cross sometimes into the more unhealthy side of those expressions.
mm,
Um, and growing up in the way that I did, mostly what I saw were those unhealthy expressions. They
mhm,
were they came from a place of fear. They came from a place of control.
mm,
And I never really got to understand or see modeled for me what assertiveness looks like without control. What, purpose and drive looks like without aggression. And it's absolutely possible. It's there.
huh,
We're capable of doing it. Um, and so it can be challenging at times to talk about, like, well, hey, here's how to be more assertive, but do it kindly and compassionately. Right. And even for myself, I mean, I spent many years as the nice guy, as the doormat, as,
mm,
falling into some of the weakened kind of expressions of masculinity. So not necessarily aggressive or unhealthy, but just really weak, right? Like uninitiated.
mhm,
And when you're in that state of lack of initiation into some of these things, assertiveness can look really aggressive.
mm,
And so for me, I steered pretty far away from those for a while until my life was falling apart. I hit rock bottom. I lost a job. I lost another marriage. There's a second one.
mm,
Um, taking responsibility, I think, is another big part of that side of the spectrum on kind of like a masculine expression of taking responsibility. And I finally got to that point in my life where I had to initiate into that. It was like,
mm,
okay, my life sucks. I'm the common denominator. What needs to change?
mm,
And so I started looking at these things very differently. Like, okay, yeah, I've steered away from assertiveness. I've steered away from discipline. I've steered away from uh, strength, because I don't want to be seen as that toxic or that unhealthy expression.
Right.
And some of that required some shadow work, some really deep healing work. Some of it required healing some of the wounded feminine within me as well, but a lot of wounded masculine, and
Mm.
that can be a little scary. So, as far as how do I address that, it's like, well, there is a different way, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily aggressive, necessarily about control, but as long as you're not coming from a place of control or fear, these expressions can be really beautiful and amazing, and invite the people we're in relation with into those things as well, and
Mm.
see that and see that integrity within
Yeah.
self.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about showing up in this way without having some of the, I don't know if it's the darkness or like the downsides of things or how things can get twisted. And
Yeah,
I look at it in as a woman, like recognizing that, well, I guess, there's been like this big push to have like boss women and like really women that are totally stepping into being in a masculine kind of energy or way of existing in the world. And I'm just curious from your perspective of like, how does that impact relationships, like
yeah.
intimate relationships?
Well, I feel like I have to throw some caveats before I before
Yeah.
I answer that question.
Yeah, throw them
Because
away.
like these topics are really polarizing,
Yeah.
and I just want to say, like, we're talking about expressions here, right? And so
Yeah.
all of these things are human expressions, and so assertiveness is available to all of us.
Mhm.
Um, Discipline is available to all of us. Nurturing, compassion, flow, all of these things are choices we can make in how we want to show up. And I think it's amazing that women are taking the reins and they're showing up, they're becoming CEOs, they're taking leadership roles, they're doing all these things that, in our society would traditionally be seen as like a masculine role.
Mhm.
And what, another kind of caveat I want to put out there is these things I'm talking about are expressions. They're not about gender roles. They're not
Yeah.
about like it's a way to show up.
Mhm.
And one thing I've found, especially, and I've worked with a lot of women that are in those roles,
Yeah.
and they're stepping in, and they're aware of it. They're like, yeah, I have to step into this expression, this way of being that doesn't feel always natural.
Mhm.
That I can do it. And I will say, most of the women I know that do that, they do it very, very well. I actually a lot
Mhm.
of times think that women can step into those expressions a little bit better than men,
Mhm.
but maybe don't necessarily want to at their core.
Yeah.
And what I see is a lot of fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
and they really desire that ability, to be able to come home and fall into their more feminine expressions. And I think a lot of women that they're in those more leadership roles, CEO type positions. um, there's probably some shadow work needed in that to kind of figure out, some of the drive and the motivation there. But I think they also need, in relation, somebody who can meet them there and show up just as strongly in it when they're not out there doing it, so that they can soften, so that they can fall
Yeah.
in to those more feminine expressions, because they're not able to in other parts of their life, work, whatever that might be. I also think that there is a lot of room for women in those positions to bring a lot of those feminine expressions in, and I think we need it.
Yeah.
So bringing some of that nurturing, bringing some of that receptiveness, some of that allowance for emotional expression in the workplace. I was talking to a client just this week about this exact thing, and how do we talk about women-owned businesses versus men-owned businesses, and using the idea of masculine expression, right? Like, a lot of businesses, corporate businesses that are run by men, it's all about the purpose of the business. Here's the product we're selling. Everything is about that. It's this very direct drive and focus to you show up, you do this, and this is what we're doing. There's no time for anything else, right?
Mhm.
Versus I work with quite a few women who work in women-owned business, and these are accounting firms. They're also, you know, kind of big corporate things that can be there, and they have a better sense of community. They have more room for, you know, the allowance of emotional expression. They have more nurturing available. It's a lot more community based, and there's a lot more allowance for, like, I guess, intimate connection between their employees. It's not just this, here's the product, this is what we're doing, there's no room for anything
Mhm.
else.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important to look at. And there's a balance, right? There's a balance between both of those, that I think we're missing. And that's what all of this is about. It's about that balance of, like,
Mhm.
here's this really great expression that can create sales, that can create drive, that can create this stuff. And then here's this other side of the expression that really focuses on more of the human nature and aspect of things, and not burning people out, and you know, creating space for you know, the human side.
Yeah.
So I personally think we need both.
Yeah.
And this is, for me, this work is never about this is better than that, or anything. It's how do we create the balance between the two? How can you know, one side of this masculine expression encourage and develop this side of the feminine expression, and invite it out,
Yeah.
and celebrate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just, as you're sharing this, thinking about, I mean, I only know my own experience through all of this, and thinking I've really been working on finding how to find more, focusing more on creating that balance, like you're saying, I think is a great way to put it, because yeah, not wanting to live all the time in one expression versus the other. And I really recognized that when I feel a sense of safety, that's when I am able to be more in a feminine expression. Whereas if I don't feel safe, then I'm like, okay, well, now I have to protect myself and I have to like show up in all of these different kinds of ways. So
Yeah.
that was just like my own personal understanding of like, okay, now that I know this, now I can find ways to create more balance for myself as I kind of live between the two. Because yeah, if you live in one all the time, you're probably going to be a little lopsided
Yeah.
figuratively and maybe physically. But I think about, I guess if let's say that someone's listening and they're in a relationship with an amazing woman who is in that place, who is leading that kind of CEO role as well in like their work life, or maybe even within the relationship itself, and that isn't necessarily something that a guy it wants to experience all of it at the time. What would you say they could do to support shifting that, or just support building the relationship that they do want to have with this person?
Well, they need to step up. And not man up, but step up. Look for ways to find opportunities to show up in those masculine expressions.
Mm.
Um, and I've been in a relationship with a woman who was that, you know, go getter, go, building a huge business, and it definitely created, you know, a little bit of conflict here and there with, you know, how she was showing up versus how I was showing up. What I what I found, kind of looking back on it now, in the moment, it was sort of hard to see these things, but there were absolutely areas where I needed to be showing up in more of these expressions, but because she was doing it, there wasn't room for me, or I
Yeah.
felt like she wouldn't allow me to. Um, and and you know, that kind of creates its own issues of things that need to be discussed and worked on. And um, but again, I think finding those opportunities of, like, where you can be decisive as a man in a relationship like that, where can you bring logic? You know, where can you be assertive? There's, you know, if she's out having to make big decisions all day and she gets home, like, don't ask her what she wants for dinner. You know, like step into those things where you can take the lead
Hmm.
on a lot of things in the home. And you know, whether it's, you know, whether she's the breadwinner or not, if she's out there doing that stuff, like, she needs that safe space where she can come home and relax into it. And so, like, really taking sovereignty over that space when you are together, when you are in that intimate space, so that she knows she has that safe place to land. is really important. And that will mean more than anything else to her, I
Mm.
think.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. And you mentioned a few minutes ago about like being this nice guy and kind of the flip side of it's possible to show up if someone is recognizing like, hey, I'm actually living in this place right now. I'm being kind of the doormat.
Mhm.
How do they shift? How do you start to make that change within yourself?
Um, so one of the things that helped me shift that was quite a while ago. I heard that nice guys are just narcissists.
Hmm.
They're just victims. And I say that from a place of being a nice guy and a doormat for many years and thinking that I was a victim.
Hmm.
And so there is a responsibility that needs to be taken for that. And owning that. And that can sound pretty harsh. But people pleasing, those kinds of expressions, they can be an unhealthy masculine expression, they can be an unhealthy feminine expression. Um, and it can also be a really like uninitiated, weakened space of fear.
Mm.
Um, and and it's challenging because you do have to start looking at, where am I not being assertive? Where am I not staying focused on the thing that I want? Where am I not taking action toward these things that I want? Where am I being more passive and trying to just allow things to happen without, being direct, without
Mhm.
making the moves that I know I need to make? And that's hard work. It's
Mhm.
hard to look at yourself and go, okay, you know what? The common denominator is me. And
Mhm.
that was my experience with it. Was it took life throwing me a whole lot of two by fours right to the head
Mm.
and kicking my ass for me to finally go, okay, I'm doing this wrong.
Mm.
I hope that, people listening, if they are in that situation, like don't have to go through that. And, a lot of good lessons come from pain.
Mhm.
They are initiations. And that's, I think that's another side of the masculine that we don't have necessarily in our society is these initiations into these expressions so that they feel more comfortable.
Mhm.
Um, Unfortunately for me, for a lot of this stuff in my life, I had to get to a point of pain that was so tremendous that the pain of figuring out how to be more assertive was less than the pain I was in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we see that with a lot of change. Any change we want to make, sometimes our current situation has to be more painful than the change feels, or more painful than the fear of changing is.
Mhm.
Right? So, facing your fear,
Mhm.
stepping up, understanding that the feminine can be friends with the nice guy. The feminine can be very nurturing and motherly to the nice guy. Um, but hey, this is a sex and intimacy podcast. Like, if you want real good intimacy and real connection,
Yeah.
like that's not going to come from being the nice guy. That doesn't mean you're not nice. It doesn't mean you're not kind,
Mhm.
right? But nice comes typically from a place of fear, from fear of really stepping up and stepping into these expressions more boldly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate the way you describe that because I think in thinking about the dynamic of an intimate relationship, like when a man sets his own boundaries or says what he's a yes for or a no for, like you can do that in a kind way. And that creates a level of understanding and attraction that
Yeah,
wouldn't have existed if you just went along with whatever the other person said. It's like flat or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I remember in talking about taking action, being assertive. I think I was 19, and I had had a couple girlfriends, and I was getting to know a new woman, and we had hung out a couple times, and I liked her, and I remember asking her if I could kiss her, and there was definitely some connection, there was some vibe there, and I was saying goodbye to her, and I was like, "Can I kiss you?" And it was like the invitation was already there, the
Mm.
moment was there, she was leaning in, and the nice guy part of me was like, "Oh, I need to ask permission." and I wasn't recognizing the things. I wasn't taking assertiveness. I wasn't taking action in that moment with an open invitation, and it completely killed it.
Yeah.
She looked up at me and she's like, "Why did you ask?"
Hmm.
And again, there was a lot of things going on here, but that's that's that intimacy thing, right? Like that taking action, that standing in your integrity and knowing your audience, knowing the situation, knowing, and that's I feared those spaces a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as the nice guy, we do,
Yeah.
right? We want to make sure that everything's okay. We want to, and we could get into a whole conversation about consent, but
Yeah.
it's that kind of thing, especially when you're already in an intimate, established relationship, right? Like,
Yeah.
so yeah, your yeses, your nos, staying integrity with those, but sometimes taking action, being
Yeah.
that strong thing that knows what it wants and goes after it.
Yeah.
And that can also be very healthy and very unhealthy, right? That's
Yeah.
that's one of those situations where the line can feel a little fuzzy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
and I guess in thinking about that, I mean, because it seems like so much of it comes down to like reading an individual and having that like that the awareness of what's unfolding. Like this is like, thank you for sharing. This is a great example of like, okay, like she's sending you all of these signals of a yes and like being able to read that and be aware of it. And yeah, I guess what would you say are if you have any like tools or exercises or practices that you recommend for somebody to build more emotional intelligence or emotional capacity.
Well, for a long time, there's and I can probably find a link to it, but there's like an emotional wheel
Hmm.
that's out there that's available. And like in the inner circle, it kind of talks, there's like 10 or 12 main emotions. It's like, anger, sadness, happy, just basic emotions. And then as it spreads out in the wheel and to the outer thing, it takes each one of those and breaks it down into more, right? Like anger is now, frustrated, irritated,
Hmm.
unnerved, fear is anxious, so then it kind of elaborates more on those. And I had that on my fridge for years. And whenever I was feeling a certain way, I would look at it and I would go, okay, what am I feeling? Well, I'm feeling a little angry. So now I look at anger and then I go, oh, well, actually, okay, maybe I'm irritated because of this situation. Or if I was feeling, really happy, I could look at that and it would give me more words. And so kind of you just sort of have to explore that and be willing to look at what you're feeling. For men, anger is allowed,
Yeah.
and that's about it,
Yeah.
right? At least that's what we're taught. And so, unfortunately, anger is really a secondary emotion. So it's always showing up because it's either covering something else up that you don't want
Hmm.
to feel or you don't understand how to feel, or it's showing up to protect a boundary. Right? Those are pretty much the only two reasons we feel anger. We're protecting a boundary or we're not feeling something underneath it.
Yeah.
And so if you can, figure out what that initial sense of what you're feeling is, a lot of times for men, it's anger, maybe it's jealousy. Um, and then go underneath that. Like what's underneath that? Is there hurt? Is there sadness? Is
Hmm.
there grief? Is there
Yeah.
worry? Is there and it's like once you can unlayer that a little bit more, you start to understand more of the inner workings. And men are just as emotional as women. We have the capacity to feel all of the things as well. We're just not taught how to understand them
Yeah.
as readily as women are, and men just don't talk about it a lot. And so we just don't have those opportunities. And so it does take a lot of self-reflection and giving yourself space to just look at it. Okay, here's what I'm feeling, this is what's on the surface. So maybe, it's this big bubbly anger. I'm feeling red in the face, whatever that is on the surface. Give yourself a moment to take a couple breaths and feel like, okay, I'm angry. So I know that's either covering this up or it's protecting a boundary. Is there a boundary I'm trying to protect? Or is there something deeper that I'm not willing to feel?
Mm.
And that's where I started of just like, okay, I'm feeling this way. Is there something underneath it
Mm.
that I'm trying to protect myself from? Maybe that boundary I'm protecting is a boundary within myself. It's from some fear of feeling this other thing. I think another big reason why men aren't necessarily as versed in feeling those deeper emotions is because a lot of times when we're younger and we have a feeling like hurt come up, like, oh, this person said this to me and it hurt. A lot of times the initial reaction of people around us or our dads or our buddies or whatever, like, oh, whatever, get over it.
Yeah.
And so there's no room for the actual expression of it, which is unfortunate.
Mhm.
Uh, Most of the men that I work with, when we start to uncover those things, like we find there's a deep, deep well of unfelt, unprocessed emotions, and they're really beautiful things
Mm.
that we can give space for, that we can feel. And if we look at the logical side of that expression, right, the masculine expression is logic versus emotion. We can't be logical about them until we feel them, until we give them space, until we
Mhm.
name them. And expressing an emotion, naming an emotion, looking at it, really diving in and trying to figure out what's underneath there, that expression of it will prevent us from projecting it.
Mm.
So it's
Mhm.
like there's a difference. So there's another spectrum we can look at, another yin and a yang of expression versus projection,
Mm.
right? Most men run around projecting all their shit because they're unwilling to look at what's inside and actually express it.
Yeah.
Expression can be kind, expression can be vulnerable and even nurturing and compassionate. Projection is almost always about fear and control.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
if from
that
like
was a
seeing
lot. That wasn't
no,
very
I
simple
know it's
either.
so
So
much. And thinking like of let's say someone doesn't fully understand what you mean by projection, could you explain kind of what that is?
yes. When we have unprocessed emotions, things that are going on the shadow side. All right. So a lot of the work that we do is shadow work, right? It's looking at the things that we don't normally see, right? Because it's in our shadow, it's dark, we can't necessarily see it. Those are things that we've hidden away. And over time, those things will build up. And then our reactions to certain situations, like when we get into a reactive state, so somebody says something, it triggers an emotional response, and we react without thinking, right? That is a projection of an unprocessed emotion.
Mhm.
And a lot of the things I've worked on in myself and what I try to help people understand through a lot of the different work that I do is if you can give yourself a moment to feel what you're feeling, you can then express instead of project.
Mhm.
Projection leads to hurt, to hurting other people. Projection leads to misunderstandings. It leads to passive aggressiveness. It's getting these things out, usually in an aggressive and a hurtful way. So when we talk about unhealthy masculine being destructive, being aggressive, being narrow-minded, it's usually a projection of these unprocessed or repressed expressions that we haven't really given space to.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, cool. Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah, no, 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 100%. And it's like that experience has to go somewhere, and because it's not being expressed, it has to be let out in some way, shape, or form, and then that's usually put onto somebody else
Yeah,
subconsciously.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in thinking about, it's so funny that you brought up the emotions wheel, because I'm in grad school and we definitely have those things all over the place. And it's interesting because a lot of people know like kind of like these primary emotions of like anger, joy, sadness, like fear,
Mhm.
but there's just such a variety of what's possible in terms of what someone can feel. And a lot of us don't actually have the vocabulary or the awareness to discern between, yeah, anger or frustration or like joy and peace or whatever it is. There's so many different
Yeah.
things that can kind of get stuck in that. And I found, I don't know if this is true for you or other people, but for me, when I get angry, if I found that if I started to actually allow myself to like be angry and like move through the anger, what I actually felt is always comes on the other side of it. Like if I allow myself to just be really angry, and then
Mhm.
usually I would like cry immediately after. Like if you get really mad and then I'm like, why am I not crying? I'm like, oh, it's because I was actually really sad and I was like afraid to feel that, or I didn't want to acknowledge that that's really how I felt. So I kind of find that anger can sometimes be this doorway into the truth of what I'm experiencing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I find really fascinating is that So anger is the only emotion that kind of really in society men are allowed to feel, but also at the
Right.
same time, like now it's not anymore. Like you can't
Yeah.
get in fights. You can't, if the second someone raises their voice, it's like people are gonna file a restraining order. Like it's just become, at least in California, I feel like more hypersensitive to this. And you brought up these rites of initiation, which is something that I think is a really beautiful part of life. And it seems like those are kind of being shut down, like thinking about, like, yeah, and maybe in some cases, probably for good cause, but like, like the hazing that happens in college or like on like going on to sports teams and having like this initiation process or like these initiations and rites of passage just aren't happening anymore. And part of that, I think, is connected to some of everything that we're talking about
Yeah.
along the way.
Yeah. In a lot of men's circles, they talk about like the archetypes. So there's the king, the warrior, the lover, the magician, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot of others too, the trickster and the green man and all these things. And they all have, like a child version. And each one of those things like requires an initiation process to go from like the boyhood expression of what that is that kind of still needs mom and needs care and needs a lot of help and maybe doesn't take a lot of responsibility and then initiating into this other version, right? That's like, oh, this is the man who takes responsibility now, and there's usually something that happens, right? And in a lot of indigenous cultures, maybe it's the first hunt and the first kill, right? Even in like the Jewish community, they have the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah, right? And it's, while maybe there's not a physical task associated to it for the men, there's still like there's a learning process. They have to go through these courses, they have to do these things, and then they have to present it, right? So they have to put themselves out there and present it in a way, and that's a really beautiful thing to have this, like, okay, there's this line and we're coming up to this line and here's what you have to do to cross the line, and now you've crossed the line.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get to go back because now you've initiated into this new way of being. And 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 that's why I like the first hunt and the first kill and things like that, because those are so much more visceral, right?
Yeah.
Or you mentioned sports, yeah, working with a coach who's an asshole, right? Like that initiates you into some things. And so there are ways in our society that we initiate. It's just not intentional,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we go into different things and different avenues of life, and we will learn things, right? We'll have these perspective shifts. And I think ultimately, like, that's what an initiation is, right? It's a perspective shift into a new way of being. And it takes awareness. It takes really looking at yourself. It takes, for men and for women too, but like for men, it takes digging down really deep and understanding you have so much more available to you, so much more strength. And it's like sometimes it's visceral to pull it out. Sometimes it does take getting in that first fight with the bully at school or things like that. And while I don't condone bullying or anything like that, it is a way our society has kind of figured out how to do some of these things without an intentional way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I was bullied as a kid, and I fought back against my bullies. I had the fight against my dad when I was 16, and set my course after that I was never going to be that way like he was, and right. So all of those little things are initiations, and we're constantly being initiated. It's just not intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've realized with this work I've been doing for the last decade or so is I've intentionally walked into those initiations, right? Like, okay, I'm going to go into this thing that's going to be really hard, and I'm going to come out different.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that. I love being able to look at these life experiences and choose for them to be your own initiation if you want them to be.
yeah,
And I think that makes everything more meaningful when you come at it from that angle.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess like in thinking about all of this, because I think sometimes like I know I can do this where I look at everything and I'm like, oh, all doom and gloom, but um I guess, you kind of like have a capacity to look at these things in a really beautiful way of more opportunity as opposed to limitations of like, this is how I'm supposed to be. It's like, no, like this is how we can be, and you have choices. You can oscillate between the two. And I'd be curious for you, like how have you found the capacity to create this balance that you live in now?
How have I found the capacity to live in it?
Yeah, yeah, like how,
Well,
because yeah.
I think it was always there. I just wasn't aware of it.
Mm,
Um, one of the things that I first started doing, I don't remember what book I read at that point, but there was this idea of initiation and kind of growing as a man and in like disciplines and things like that. And it was just the idea of leaning just over your edge, right? Finding opportunities to, go just a little bit out of your comfort zone. If we go too far, we're going to fall on our face,
mhm,
right? So it's finding those things that are just outside the edge of our comfort. So whether it's um, pushing the weight just one more rep when you think you can't.
mhm,
Maybe it's, just getting up the nerve to talk to the barista at the coffee shop and ask her out, or just putting yourself in a situation that's like, this feels uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it anyways.
mhm,
And the more we do that, the more that capacity grows. So, but it doesn't take a lot. You don't have to change everything and go do the biggest race that you can find, or it's like go a little bit, just a little bit past your edge, but keep doing it
mhm.
and keep finding those opportunities to do it. And yeah, it'll be a little uncomfortable. And sometimes, you may go a little too far and fall on your face, but you can pick yourself back up
Yeah.
and your capacity will grow.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if this was the book that you read, but I read The Talent Code. I think it's by like number of years ago, and they basically talked about they looked at all of like the most successful athletes, performers, artists, whatever out there, and they found that they were most often living just on this edge where it wasn't too easy where they didn't have to apply themselves, but it also wasn't so hard that they failed. It was just enough where
Yeah.
they had, yeah, and I think living like just on that line in life is really a helpful way to create like massive change. It doesn't have to be, yeah, as you're saying, like you don't have to go do these huge things. It's doing all of these small things repeatedly that make
Yeah.
the biggest difference. Well,
Well, and that's discipline.
yeah.
Well, and living on that line, I like the way that you talked about that. I might have to read that book. I have not read that book.
It's good.
Um, one of the big things I talk about with these expressions is choice.
Mm,
And living on the line is challenging because it allows us to choose our direction in any moment. But
mm,
that means we have to be aware of our direction in any moment. Am I going to choose to push the weight a little bit more today? Or am I going to choose to let myself relax? Am I going to choose to push here or choose here? But even with the expressions, in certain cases, with my partner, there are times when, I'm on that line and something is coming up between us and I have to choose, am I going to choose the logical expression here or am I going to choose the emotional expression?
mhm,
Right. And so even this spectrum, this polarity, it's like there's a line in the middle. And I will tell you the middle road is the hardest one to travel because it
mhm,
allows you to be in choice all the time. And choice can be scary.
mhm.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
choice is also important.
I love that. Well, in thinking about everything we talked about, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think is important to address when we look at masculine, feminine, not being the nice guy anymore, all of these sorts of things?
I was not sure where all this was going to go when we started talking today, and without going too far into it, all of these things that we've been talking about make an impact in the bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
like kind of at the core of all the work that I've done over the years, like that has been like the biggest benefit. Like it has built and strengthened that intimate container that I've been able to hold with my partners. And I don't want to say for them because it takes both.
Yeah.
But again, that integrity, that choice, that ability to express versus project, right? It builds that safety. It
Mm.
builds that compassion and trust within all of your relationships, but most importantly in your intimate relationships.
Yeah.
And it is that invitation for your feminine counterpart to show up in amazing and beautiful ways that like I can't even explain. Like I'm blown away over and over again by how, stepping into some of these things that I thought were so hard and were impossible or were too aggressive or were controlling because I only saw unhealthy expressions of them, have nurtured such a beautiful space
Mm.
for vulnerability, for expression, for intimacy, connection, pleasure, ecstasy, all of those things. So, like, at the end of the day, like, that's kind of what all this is about. And at least that's what it's been about for me.
Oh my gosh,
And
I love that. I
I'm
love
glad you're
that.
laughing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate that you brought that up because I think it's so true. And I mean, I find that like how we are in our life is often how we show up in our sex life and kind of vice versa. So if you can find the ways to enhance your dynamic when you're out living your life, you can then and so change the way that you have sex as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I recently had a conversation with this author, Ogie Ogus, and he was talking about how he looked at all of these pornography searches and found that out of like regardless of sexual identity, sexual orientation, like relationship style, like the number one like search and the number one kind of desire that all humans have is like this dominance and submission type of a dynamic within intimacy. And I think that we could kind of like look at those words a little similarly in like some ways in comparison to
Yeah.
the yin and yang as well. And how like everyone really craves that and wants that. And it's
Mhm.
interesting to have this conversation and understand that it so closely connects with that as well
Yeah.
is
Well,
cool.
and we could look at dominance and submissive as a masculine and feminine dynamic, right?
Hmm.
I mean, in my own intimate relationships, like I have seen that when I show up in that strength, and again, it's not control, it's not aggression or destructive, but when the masculine can show up in that strength, it allows, whether it's dominating or um, courageous or just strong, right? You show up in that integrity that like, yes, this is who I am, this is what I'm here for, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm going to do to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that allows the feminine to fall into that beautiful, we can use the word submissive, but it's
Hmm.
allowance, it's flow,
Hmm.
it's passive, it is receptive, it's
Yeah.
captivating. And I will say what I've found in my partnerships where my partner has allowed herself to fall into that. First of all, it is the most amazing and beautiful thing I've ever witnessed.
Mhm.
And it allowed me to show up even more in it
Mhm.
and to learn and to lean even more over the edge
Mhm.
and to gain that. And then it becomes an interplay because then you're both just playing in that expression, right?
Mhm.
It's like, then maybe she can choose the more dominant expression and you can choose the more submissive expression. And like it becomes this really amazing flow. But
Mhm.
it takes that safety and trust.
Yeah.
And that comes in all those other areas,
Yeah.
right? It's like you can't develop it there in the bedroom until it is seen everywhere else.
Yeah.
The feminine is always testing the masculine.
Mhm.
I think we talked about this a little bit before the call, but
Yeah.
just asking, what do you want for dinner? Like that is a test from the feminine
Mhm.
to find out, are you going to be decisive? Are you going to take the lead? Can I relax into and let myself flow and know that you got me?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's all connected
It is.
in all of these really beautiful ways. Um, well, Nate, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where I know you have a lot going on, and I know you have a retreat coming up too, and I was looking at all of
Yeah.
your info. So where can men find you if they want to connect with you, join your men's group, all of those sorts of things?
Yeah, so ignitermensgroup.com is my website. We do in-person classes every other Tuesday here in Denver. We have some online classes as well. We have a 3-month group coaching program. I do some one-on-one coaching, and then yeah, there's a retreat coming up in August. We're going to go up to Breckenridge. It'll be a small group. I'm thinking 8 guys total, but we're going to do some breath work. I'm a breath work facilitator, and that's been a huge thing for shadow work and healing trauma and all of those things for me. And I think it's really important for men to engage in that. But it'll be a community. We're going to do some breath work, and we're going to hike a 14er. So a nice big challenge. I might
Ooh.
be leaning over the edge for more over the edge for some people, but we're going to
Yeah.
do an easier one. But yeah, I'm really excited for that one. It should be a pretty powerful 3 days. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Cool. Well, Nate, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate having you here.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Naked Connection. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Trust me on this, your sex life and that special someone in your life will thank you for it. And if you really love the show, please take a moment and leave a 5-star review or a written review and let me know what you think. It would mean so much to me and this show. Until next time, happy connecting.